October 17, 1883. The air over the high plains of Wyoming carried a brittle, crystalline edge that had no business arriving before November. Adelaide ran a gloved hand over the last piece of split pine, its surface rough against the worn leather. She placed it carefully atop the cord of firewood stacked against the north wall of their small cabin, the pile neat and tight, a testament to a summer of relentless labor. It looked respectable enough, a solid 2 cords, maybe a little more. It was what any sensible settler would aim for. From the doorway, her husband, Orville, watched her. He was a man made of the same quiet, durable materials as the land itself, 20 years her senior, with lines around his eyes that held the memory of 2 decades more of sun and snow than hers. The town of Providence Creek still whispered about their marriage, about the quiet girl who had arrived with nothing but a carpet bag and a name, and the solitary rancher who had taken her in and then, to everyone's surprise, taken her as his wife. Adelaide picked up the small, leather-bound ledger that rested on the porch rail, its pages filled with her grandmother's precise script and her own careful additions. She made a final notation with a stub of a pencil. What no one in the valley knew, what no one could even imagine, was that this visible stack of wood was a lie. It was a performance for the benefit of neighbors and the cold judgment of the town. The true work, the real preparation, was hidden beneath the very floorboards they walked on. True security is not what you show the world. It is what you build in the dark, when no one is watching. That evening, the first hard frost fell, leaving a silver armor on every blade of grass and turning the water in the horse trough to a pane of cloudy glass. The cold snap drove everyone into town for the weekly gathering at Hemlock's Mercantile, a place that smelled of coffee beans, kerosene, and the slow certainty of debt. Mr. Hemlock stood behind his counter, a man whose piety was as starched and clean as his collar. He spoke of prudence and of God's will, his voice a smooth, polished stone. He had sold nearly every family in the valley their winter supplies on credit, and his benevolence was a chain they all wore willingly. He gestured toward the dwindling stock of green, unseasoned wood he was selling at an obscene markup. "The good Lord provides for those who plan," he announced, his eye sweeping the room. "But he has little patience for the foolish or the slothful." Several men nodded, their faces grim in the lantern light. Hemlock's gaze fell on Orville, who stood silently by the door with Adelaide at his side. "Orville, I passed your place this morning. A decent pile you have." "Barely decent. I hope for your young wife's sake it is enough." The words were coated in a thin layer of concern, but the judgment underneath was clear. Orville simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He did not defend himself. He did not explain that he and Adelaide had spent the summer felling trees far up on the ridges, timber the town considered too difficult to reach, wood that was seasoned and dense. He did not speak of the long hours hauling it down, piece by piece, on a stone boat pulled by their old mule. The town saw a quiet, aging man and his strange, young wife with their modest woodpile, and they drew their own conclusions. Therefore, when the meeting was over, Orville and Adelaide walked home under a sky full of cold, indifferent stars, the silence between them not empty, but full of a shared and secret purpose. They had seen the fear in their neighbors' eyes, and the arrogance in Hemlock's. They knew what was coming. Back inside the cabin, the warmth from the cast-iron stove was a small circle of defiance against the growing cold. Orville bolted the door. He didn't speak for a long moment, simply stood looking at the wide plank floor in the center of the room. Adelaide watched him, her hands clasped in front of her, the ledger resting on the small kitchen table. This was the moment. The performance for the outside world was done for the night. Now came the real work. Orville knelt, his knees cracking softly, and found the seam in the floorboards that was invisible to any but the two of them. He slid a small, flat iron pry bar into the groove and lifted. A section of the floor, 5 feet square, rose up on hidden hinges, revealing not darkness, but the top rungs of a sturdy wooden ladder. A scent rose from the opening, a clean, sharp smell of cold earth, pine resin, and thyme. It was the smell of their secret, the smell of their survival. For the entire summer, while the town watched them build their small, visible woodpile, they had been engaged in another project. They had dug. Down into the hard, rocky soil beneath their cabin, they had carved out a cellar, shoring up the walls with thick timbers and laying a floor of flat stones. It was a root cellar, a storm shelter, and most importantly, a hidden woodshed. Adelaide lit a second lantern and handed it to Orville. He descended into the earth, his boots thudding softly on each rung. She followed, and when her feet touched the stone floor, she held her own lantern high. The light spilled across a fortress of firewood. It was stacked to the ceiling in tight, interlocking rows, a breathtaking quantity of it, more than the mercantile had in its entire yard. There were 10 cords, perhaps 12, of seasoned oak and pine, all cut, split, and stored in the dry, stable cool of the earth. Here was their true answer to hemlock. Here was their quiet rebellion. Orville reached up and pulled the heavy trapdoor closed, plunging them into a silent, subterranean world of their own making. The first snows arrived a week later, not the gentle dustings of a normal year, but a thick, wet blanket that bent the pines and snapped the branches of the cottonwoods along the creek. The cold did not retreat. It settled in, a permanent guest. Within a fortnight, the valley was locked in a state of premature winter, and the town's mood began to sour. The green wood from Hemlock's store hissed and sputtered in stoves, giving off more smoke than heat. People began to ration, their faces tight with a worry they had not anticipated. One afternoon, there was a knock on the cabin door. It was Martha, their nearest neighbor, a woman whose own husband had died of fever 2 years prior. Her face was pinched, her shawl pulled tight around her thin shoulders. "Adelaide," she began, her eyes darting to their modest woodpile, now dusted with snow. I wonder if I might borrow a few logs. Just until my son can get the wagon up the north road. The wood we got from the mercantile is wet through." Adelaide looked at the woman's chapped hands and the desperation in her eyes. This was the first test. She looked at Orville, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He went outside without a word and loaded Martha's arms with logs from the visible pile, a generous portion that made their own supply look even more precarious. "God bless you, Orville," Martha said, her relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. She hurried away, bent against the wind. They watched her go. Giving away the wood that everyone thought was all they had was a risk. It invited more requests. It deepened the illusion of their own vulnerability. But to refuse would have been to become the very thing they despised in Hemlock, people who held the key to warmth while their neighbors shivered. They were not hoarding for themselves. They were preparing for what they knew others had not. The act of giving was part of that preparation, a quiet statement that their wealth was not in the wood itself, but in the knowledge that there was more, so much more, hidden just beneath their feet. That night, with the wind howling a low, mournful song around the eaves of the cabin, Adelaide sat by the fire and opened her grandmother's ledger. The book was her most prized possession, more valuable than any tool or acre of land. Her grandmother had been a woman who paid attention. She had lived through droughts and floods, through winters that the old men still called starvation winters. She had believed that the land always told you what was coming, if you only knew how to listen. Adelaide ran her finger over the familiar, spidery script. "The squirrels hoard hardest before the worst winters," one entry read. "Watch the woolly worms, no band of brown means no relief." Adelaide remembered the squirrels in late summer, frantic and fat. She remembered the caterpillars, solid black from end to end. Her own notations filled the margins. August 21st, aspen leaves yellowing from the top down. A sign of deep frost to come. September 5th, no cricket song after sundown. The cold is coming early. It was all there, a litany of small, natural warnings that the town, in its hurry and its trust in men like Hemlock, had completely ignored. This ledger was her mentor. It was the source of the quiet confidence that allowed her to face Hemlock's scorn and Martha's pity with the same calm demeanor. The knowledge within its pages was a kind of fire itself, a warmth that had been passed down through the female line, a legacy of watchfulness and care. Orville came and sat beside her, placing his large, calloused hand over hers on the open page. He never asked what she was reading. He did not need to. He had seen the truth of her grandmother's wisdom in the world around them, and he had trusted it. He had trusted her. Together, they had built their ark of wood and earth, not on a foundation of fear, but on a foundation of attention. They sat in the warm silence, listening to the storm, two people against the world, yet somehow prepared to save it. The storm that had been threatening for weeks finally broke in the first days of December. It was not a snowstorm, it was a blizzard, a white fury that erased the world. For 3 days, the wind screamed, piling drifts higher than the cabin roofs and burying fences completely. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there. The valley fell silent. Smoke, which had been trickling from the chimneys of Providence Creek, began to disappear. First one chimney went dark, then another, then a third. Each wisp of smoke that vanished was a sign of a fire gone out, a family now huddled together in the freezing dark. Dr. Alastair, a man of science and skepticism, tried to make his rounds, his horse struggling through the immense drifts. He was a good man, but a tired one, and he saw the town's predicament with a physician's grim clarity. People were burning furniture. They were burning fence posts they could dig out of the snow. They were burning hope. The supply of green wood from hemlocks was worse than useless, a cruel joke that left rooms filled with acrid smoke but no warmth. The dread in the town became a palpable thing, as cold and as heavy as the air itself. At the Hemlock House, the largest in town, smoke still billowed thick and black from 2 chimneys. The merchant had, of course, saved the best, most seasoned wood for himself. The town that had listened to him, that had trusted his judgment, was now freezing while he sat in warmth and comfort, his piety a shield against their suffering. In their small cabin, Orville and Adelaide kept their fire banked low. They had more than enough fuel to roar a blaze up the chimney, but they understood the cruelty of that image. Their small, steady plume of smoke was a quiet beacon, but also a question. To the town, it was a puzzle. How could the old man and his strange wife, with their tiny woodpile, still have fire when so many others had none? The breaking point came on the 4th day of the blizzard. The wind had lessened, but the cold was a physical presence, a predator at every door. A frantic pounding broke the stillness of the afternoon. It was Martha, her face a mask of terror, her shawl covered in ice. "It's my boy," she cried, stumbling inside. "The fever's come back. He's shaking so hard. Dr. Alastair. I can't get to him. The drifts are over my head." Orville was pulling on his heaviest coat before she finished speaking. "I'll get him," he said. It wasn't a promise, it was a statement of fact. He disappeared into the blinding white. Adelaide was left with Martha, who huddled by the stove, weeping. Not 10 minutes later, there was another, more arrogant pounding at the door. It was Mr. Hemlock. His face was red with cold and fury. He pushed his way inside, not waiting for an invitation. "You," he snarled, his eyes fixing on Adelaide. "You still have fire. My man saw the smoke. You've been hoarding. The town is freezing, and you sit here on a pile of wood while children get sick." He pointed a finger at Martha. "Her child. This is on you." Adelaide stood very still. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked at him, her gaze as steady and unyielding as winter granite. "We have what we need, Mr. Hemlock. I am the town council," he blustered. "I am requisitioning your supply for the good of the community. Where is it? Show me." Adelaide did not move. The confrontation was no longer about wood. It was about his power against her knowledge, his loud authority against her quiet truth. "There is enough," she said, her voice soft but carrying an immense weight. He took a step toward her, his hand raised, his face contorted in a mask of righteous rage. And in that moment, the door opened again. Orville stood there, covered in snow, and behind him was Dr. Alastair, his medical bag in hand. Dr. Alastair took in the scene at a glance, Martha weeping by the stove, Hemlock poised to strike, Adelaide standing like a statue, and Orville, a silent, snowy guardian in the doorway. The doctor's tired eyes missed nothing. He had just come from a dozen homes where the air was colder inside than out, where children were wrapped in every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the air. He had also just passed Hemlock's house, from which the comfortable glow of multiple lamps and the thick scent of burning oak emanated. He looked at Hemlock's well-fed, furious face, and then at Adelaide's calm, resolute one. "Hemlock," the doctor said, his voice sharp with exhaustion and contempt. "Go home. You are not needed here. This woman is hoarding wood. Hemlock sputtered. "While good people suffer." Dr. Alastair walked past him and knelt beside Martha. "Let's see to the boy," he said gently, before turning his gaze back to Orville and Adelaide. "I must confess," he said, his voice low, "I do not understand it. Your pile outside is nearly gone. Yet you have a good fire, a warm house. How?" Orville looked at Adelaide. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. The secret had served them well. It had kept them safe. But its purpose was never merely their own survival. Adelaide knew this. Her grandmother's ledger was not just a book of signs, it was a book of responsibilities. You paid attention so that you could act. You prepared so that you could provide. Adelaide walked to the center of the room and knelt. She slid her fingers along the invisible seam and lifted the edge of the trapdoor. A puff of cool, earthy air rose into the room. Dr. Alastair stared, his mouth slightly agape. Hemlock, who had been about to protest, fell silent, his eyes wide with disbelief. Adelaide took a lantern from the mantel. "Doctor," she said. "Please. Come see." She descended the ladder, and one by one, the others followed her down into the earth, down into the heart of their secret. The lantern light bloomed, revealing the impossible, magnificent truth of the woodpile. The sight of the underground woodshed struck the small group dumb. Dr. Alastair slowly turned in a circle, his lantern held high, illuminating the towering, perfectly stacked walls of split logs. It was a cathedral of foresight. Martha let out a soft cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated awe. Even Hemlock, the architect of the town's misery, could only stare, his arrogance finally shattered by the sheer, undeniable reality of the provision before him. He saw not just wood, but the evidence of a summer of labor he had dismissed, a wisdom he had mocked, and a unity of purpose he could not comprehend. He looked small and insignificant in the face of it. Orville began passing logs up to the doctor, who stacked them by the cabin door. Wordlessly, a system was established. The doctor, a man of science, became a hauler of wood. Martha, her own crisis momentarily forgotten in the face of this miracle, began directing a small stream of neighbors who had been drawn by the commotion. They came with sleds, with wheelbarrows, with outstretched arms. There was no chaos, only a stunned, reverent quiet. Adelaide stood at the bottom of the ladder, her hand resting on a stack of pine, the scent of the wood filling her senses. She watched the faces of her neighbors as they looked upon the supply. She saw shame, yes, but more than that, she saw a dawning understanding. They had been led astray by a loud voice, and saved by a quiet one. Hemlock tried to speak, to reclaim some shred of his authority. We should organize this," he started, his voice hollow. Dr. Alastair cut him off without looking at him. "You will take your turn like everyone else, Hemlock. And you will take the smallest portion." It was not a suggestion. The social order of Providence Creek was being unmade and remade in this cellar, built on a new foundation of quiet competence and shared survival. Adelaide looked at Martha, who gave her a look of profound, tearful gratitude. The debt was not one of wood, but of belief. The reckoning had come, not with a clash of anger, but with the simple, heavy weight of a split oak log being passed from one hand to another. As the last of the blizzard faded and a pale, watery sun returned to the sky, the town of Providence Creek was transformed. Every home had a fire. The sick began to recover. The oppressive cold was broken, not just in the air, but in the spirit of the community. Orville and Adelaide's cabin became the quiet center of the valley, the place from which warmth and life had flowed back into the frozen arteries of the town. They never spoke a word of accusation against Hemlock. They did not need to. His authority had evaporated like frost in the morning sun, leaving behind only the shame of his selfishness, a punishment far more lasting than any public condemnation. He kept to his house, his own fires a mark of his disgrace rather than his comfort. The people of the town brought gifts. Not as payment, for they knew the wood was a gift that could never be repaid, but as offerings of respect. A sack of flour. A jar of preserved peaches. A mended harness. Dr. Alastair stopped by one evening, long after the crisis had passed. He stood at the door, hat in hand. "I misjudged you," he said, the words simple and clean. "Both of you." "I apologize," Orville just nodded. Adelaide met the doctor's eyes. "The signs were there," she said softly. "You only had to look." It was all the explanation she would ever give. That spring, as the snow melted and the creek began to run high and clear, the men of the town showed up at their cabin with axes and saws. They did not ask. They simply went with Orville up to the high ridges and began felling trees for the next winter, their labor a silent, ongoing apology and a promise. Adelaide stood on her porch, her grandmother's ledger open on the rail. She watched them work, a community reborn not by sermons or laws, but by the shared memory of a killing cold and the astonishing grace of a hidden warmth. The earth beneath the cabin was just earth again, but it would forever hold the story of the winter when survival was dug from the ground, and a town learned to listen to the quiet voices.